So Mike, we're going to have a little interview. So my first question is, you talk about data being the key to delivering net zero buildings, but data is a very, very vague term in many respects. People have different perceptions of what data is. And what data are you talking about, and what systems thinking are you talking about introducing around the role of data?
Yes, thanks, Pippa. Thanks for that intro as well. Although I'm not sure looking at me on a screen is easier on the eye than a presentation, but yeah, so good question. Fundamentally, building systems have been generating digital data for over 30 years. I think buildings were really an early example of the digitalization of automation, which I think was a logical step back in the day, because when you think about it, commercial buildings, the building services behind commercial buildings have got kind of thousands of moving parts, historically moving, working autonomously with lots of them hidden away in the ceiling and so on, and pneumatic systems and things, hopefully working properly and possibly, with people periodically checking them. So the digitalization of that was a really logical step. And given that we're talking, I'm sure as everyone realizes, about systems that are controlling 60 to 80% of the energy consumption in the building, kind of this notion that you need a brain and a central nervous system, fundamentally, something that's feeling what's going on in the building, was entirely appropriate. So things like building management systems were conceived, lighting management systems, and so on. And they've, evolved over the subsequent decades. To give you a sense of scale, these days, what we're looking at typically is anywhere between 1.5 to 2 data points per square meter of treated floor space. So, in a typical commercial building, you're talking about tens or even hundreds of thousands of points of reference. So data from all of those points is what we're talking about, looking at that information. And I suppose a kind of observation, I suppose, of my own. I was involved in building management systems very early on, being that old. I got very excited as a kind of young engineer about the principle of digitalizing the building services I was working with. But for some, various reasons, I suppose, over the decades, the importance of those systems seems to have got diluted, and the focus on the data has been diminished, I suppose. And somehow, the focus on that kind of data, I think, has floundered, and its relevance in energy efficiency. So that's really what we're trying to pull out.
Okay, so you're talking about quite a proliferation of data, a phenomenal amount of data. I think you said something about sort of something like the cheese grater building in London having how many data points?
About 200,000.
200,000 data points in a building of that size, which is phenomenal. How is it possible to get insight from that volume of data? Would it not just bog down the operational teams? Can you have too much of a good thing?
Well, absolutely. I think it's been quite a theme today. It's about contextualizing data, and it's about what you do with it. I mean, the reason we exist, really, or I suppose the reason we got Demand Logic together was, it was my job. That was my job, was to try to make sense as a human of all of that data. I was the kind of grubby one in the plant room, sitting on a cable drum with a laptop, trying to look at traces of everything, work out what was good and bad performance. Now, obviously, you can't do that with 200,000 things. You can do it with as many as you can in time. So really, unwittingly, I suppose, we've been asking building operational teams to work like that. It's way too much data to work out, to analyze manually. So typically people are responding to complaints, looking at, I don't want to be too critical of the BMS industry, but like things like relatively crude binary type alarms, that temperature is too high, so go and do something. That's not really analysis of performance. That's much more reactive, kind of panic mode. Let's go and suddenly look at this thing. So obviously, that is what computer systems are for. If you've got all of that much data, something that doesn't get bored crunching it, something that will work 24/7, and be able to sort of continually carry out the calculations that are necessary to get something useful out of that. You know, the first step obviously is rationalizing and turning the data into something that makes sense. So contextualizing it, turning, you know, Jennifer earlier was, you know, talking about digital twins. Absolutely, you know, contextualizing BMS data is really about making a digital twin of building services. So, you know, a subset of the building, but you know, really relevant information, I suppose. So if you get the digital twin right, and the digital twin knows what optimal performance is supposed to be, then you just compare what optimal performance is supposed to be to what's actually happening, and the kind of output is the anomalies. And, you know, with more and more AI coming into play, that sort of thing is going to get simpler and simpler for a machine to do. At the minute, you know, the challenges that we see, and a lot of work we've put in has been about how do you actually turn all of that data into something useful? Not necessarily, surprisingly, I think, some people about how do you analyze it? It's like, how do you know how to analyze it? Because what does that actually mean? What does that thing belong to? And what's the relationship between that and that? So AI is really, you know, that's again what AI has been born for, that sort of role. So we really see that as the future, you know, getting to the point where you have a kind of plug and play analysis coming on.
Okay, so we're looking at taking existing and developing technologies and rethinking our relationship with data in a fairly major way, and using this massive processing capacity that we have now, which we didn't have 30 years ago. You know, the ability to number crunch and to have servers that can process, etc. It just wasn't there, and it is now available, and the AI. So by rethinking our relationship with this data and using it in a particular way, it's changing the role of data in reaching net zero ambitions. So you've talked about a new metric on building performance standards, and you think this is very necessary. There's lots of work going on with new standards in the UK, and such as Zana just referred to, the UK version of Neighbours and other building standards that have just been consulted on. Why do you believe a data standard is necessary?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we fully support Neighbours, and I think, you know, as Zana was showing, it gives you great insight into the symptoms of, you know, what's going wrong, you know, looking at energy performance and so on. The standard we're talking about, you know, we're looking at is not so much a standard about data. In fact, having said that, though, there are standards emerging now about the ontology, so how data should be, you know, data in systems like that should be named so that it can be analyzed in a standard way, so that that will make the whole process a lot easier. At the moment, though, with the built environment, that doesn't exist. You know, you've got most of the buildings that are built now will be around for some time. So we have to work with what we have. So turning that kind of existing, somewhat irrational data into something sensible is a real challenge. And the standard that, or rather, let's say the methodology that we're sort of talking about and looking for collaborators on and advocacy around, I suppose, is much more about, once you've, you know, this is a kind of building services question. It's like, what should good performance really look like? So if you've got all of the data about all of the, I mean, if you look at something like the humble fan core unit, how do you give it a score as to how well it's working? You know, it sounds like it should be really straightforward, like, you know, did it achieve its target? You know, did it achieve its temperature target? Well, of course, yeah, that's part of a score. You know, how quickly did it achieve it is another part of a score. How much apparent effort did it use to achieve that? You know, and so on. Did it appear to be influencing something else? You know, these are all, you know, kind of become more and more complex questions. What I suppose, what I should have reiterated on your previous point was that, because of the complexity of all of that data, you know, or the proliferation of all of that data, if you can actually distill that down, you know, which is what we're doing now, we'd love to get, you know, this as good as it can be. But if you can distill it down into a building operational performance score, which is, you know, scoring a building for three key KPIs. One is the obvious energy performance, but another is obviously around comfort and productivity, because that's what a building's for. And the third is around the maintenance effectiveness. Another big and kind of valuable use of data like this is to make maintenance more efficient. If you can actually get the right resource to a problem straight away, and that might be a remote resource if it's a BMS fix, or it might be one of the site-based FM teams, something like that. If you get the right person to the right thing first time, then everybody benefits from that. Things are fixed quickly and at the least cost. So at the minute, there are challenges with that. When your FM team's responding to symptoms like a complaint or something like that, then the first person who visits the problem might identify it as being something that is can be resolved by someone else. So they pass that on, and then it passes backwards and forwards and so on. If you can start to streamline that, then the whole thing gets more and more cost effective. So if you can distill those kind of three key areas down to a single operational performance score, then you can have non-technical stakeholders, the kind of portfolio and asset managers, getting an at-a-glance view of all of their buildings across their portfolio. And if you trust the metrics, and this is key, obviously, is that you have to have everybody who has a understanding of the subject to have a good look and see if there's a better way of doing it. But if once there's a accepted and trusted methodology, then you can trust that score as a non-technical stakeholder. So from the hundreds of thousands of bits of information down to a single score that tells you whether you're on track or not. So that's the nature of what we're trying to do with this this new methodology, I suppose. Okay,
so we hear a lot of talk about collaboration, and this is a very big ambition. It's not something Demand Logic could do alone. Are you looking at collaborating, convening across the sector? Are you taking people with you on this journey?
Definitely. I mean, we fully favour collaboration at every level. One of the tools we built in our platform very early on was actually online conversation and dialogue around issues. There were a couple of reasons for that. One was about really because of the having come from that background where you're the kind of the as I say, the grubby one in the basement getting beaten up when someone's too hot or too cold, trying to get engineers out of their shells and sort of working more closely with more senior stakeholders and getting credit where when things have been improved was something that we were really keen to do. So being able to collaborate online, discuss issues, and show that they've been resolved was a really great start to that, a great first move. But in terms of collaborating on this metric, no, absolutely, as you said, we came up with our first iteration of that, not really because we were trying to, come up with a new standard. It's just that it didn't feel anything else we were working with fixed. So we're really, really excited about the idea of opening this up, sort of going open source with the methodology. We've had some very early conversations with Andy at LSBU, with the RICS. We're hoping to get some buy-in from CIBSE, but anybody, for consultants too. So anyone, with a background in building services who fancies collaborating with us on this, we really would, be excited to get involved.
That sounds really good. So if you we'll include a link in our follow-up, and we will announce when something firmer has taken, when you've got something on the table, and then people who are signed up can will hear about it, and also members of CIBSE, etc. I'm sure we'll hear as it unfolds. It sounds very ambitious. Is it going to be expensive to roll out? Is it going to be an affordable incentive?
It's going to be extremely cheap, Pippa. Very, very good value.
I knew you'd say that.
No, I mean, obviously there's a cost to everything, but I mean, our experience is that the cost benefit is kind of a no-brainer. On energy savings alone, it's so known. There are so many studies on, the current energy performance of buildings. You can really smash the cost of doing this just by, just on your energy savings alone. But then you think of the other, less tangible opportunities, I suppose. The first one is about, you know, the buildings being fit for purpose. So I think it was the Stoddart Review kind of found that I think it's something like a 1% increase in productivity would add something like 20 billion to the UK economy. It's like staggering amounts of money, and that's in the context of something like 50% of a building occupier saying that their environment is actually negatively impacting their productivity. So if you know, if those two things are true, then in terms of, you know, a UK PLC, there's a huge benefit there. The other one, you know, that we're excited about too, is about how the FM industry is changing and how data-driven facilities management could really revolutionize, you know, that industry. At the minute, you know, I don't think it's much of a secret, but, you know, FMs are working on pretty low margins. You know, they're really they're struggling. I think there's a real opportunity to make such efficiencies there that they could be on a decent margin with a better service. So that's, yeah. I think.
Yeah, and you also mentioned something to me about a boiler the size of a double-decker bus. If you get that right, tell that anecdote to the audience. You know, what happens if you treat it right? Oh,
it's, yeah. I mean, it's staggering if you actually look at commercial buildings in context of houses. I mean, there was one stat that we were looking at where it was a big London office, but it was still a single office building. Now on, I think it was a March day in 2018, it was like the coldest March day on record in the UK. And that building was generating the equivalent cooling of running 500 UK homes, the electricity of 500 UK homes. Now that cooling was then being compensated for by additional heating, which was, you know, the gas consumption of another 500 or 600 UK homes. It's staggering amounts of energy. That's not the consumption of the building. That was clear and evident waste, you know, that could just be fixed like that. Surely, it's the no-brainer.
Yeah, and if you get it right and you stop the boiler pumping to counter faulty cooling, you can save 5 years of life cycle of that very expensive piece of kit.
Exactly.
So it has a huge impact on embodied carbon too.
That's right.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
So how can our audience today support this standard, and in their everyday working lives and in their role as industry influencers? How can they think of data differently, and what can they do?
Well, you know, where the challenge is clear. You know, it's Earth Day, so our path to net zero is the obvious step. When you look at how, you know, and this isn't just us saying it, there's so many studies on how existing buildings are performing so far away from their design performance. You know, we see absolutely daily simultaneous heating and cooling. It's endemic in the UK. Surely the first step to net zero is just fix these obvious, you know, hemorrhages of energy. And so a pragmatic look at existing buildings and the wastage. So we think this the use of smart data is the quickest and easiest win. So if anybody's interested in joining us, you know, in looking at the metrics, the methodology and so on, we'd love to get in touch. We haven't formally launched anything, but if you want to sort of register some early interest, then please do get in touch. We'll share some contact details shortly.